I want to personally thank all of you who stayed for the lads' presentation and the meal. I think I counted 60-something that stayed for the meal. If you look around at our Sunday night crowd, you might think that the church is just way too old. But if you pay attention to the young families, it encourages you that the church has a great deal of hope for the future. And we have 2 more babies that are going to be born in our church family this year. So we've got a lot of babies coming along, and the lads program has shifted considerably in its average age. If you saw the presentation, you saw how young a lot of these kids are. But that's where we want to start with them. Start with them when they're young and keep them trained. Tonight we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19. And our whole time will be spent here in this chapter. It is not just a modern challenge that God doesn't answer our prayers as quickly as we'd like for Him to. God's children have struggled with this problem for a very long time, because God does not always work in spectacular ways. His presence sometimes is seen, felt, we might say, in some quiet ways. In fact, in the song that Mark led us in, "This is my Father's world," the expression says, "In the rustling grass I hear Him pass. He speaks to me everywhere." So Mark, that song fits the sermon tonight. Where is God? Where is God when we're praying? Where is God when we're hurting? Where is God when we feel like failures? If there were a book on how to do mission work, our team did it by the book. We went as a team. We were quite united as a team. We made sure we were on the same page doctrinally speaking. We learned the language. Everything that experienced missionaries practically said you need to do mission work right, we did it. And we prayed constantly for our work. We mailed out flyers eventually into every home in Iași, Romania, which was probably over 100,000. But we wound up coming back to the United States early because we had gotten disheartened. I don't know about the other team members, but I asked myself, why didn't God answer our prayers more? Why couldn't we see more growth? I don't know. I don't know why God does the things that He does. Or we might say, I don't know why God doesn't do things that He doesn't do. Pain can cause us to question God's goodness, God's power, God's blessing. You take a family who loses a child, and their pain is, why did God allow it to happen? Where was God? I've had a book in my library from my dad's library for several decades. I haven't read it until yesterday. I started reading it. It's called Graduation to Glory by Fern Hill. And I always thought it was a book intended for high school graduates. And that's probably why I hadn't picked it up in decades. But it's not. It's a mom coping with the loss of her 13-year-old son. He was killed by a truck riding his bicycle on the way to school. This little boy, he was a Christian already, and he had bright hopes for a future, and he wanted to establish a ranch for homeless boys. And so I get on Google and I ask this morning or yesterday morning, is there a boys' ranch in the state of New York today in honor or memory of Timothy Hill? Not only, and the book was written back in the early 1970s. 1974, I think the book was copyrighted. He was killed in 72. Not only is there a boys' ranch in honor of Timothy Hill, but there are 4 other locations some 50 years later. That's one way that she coped with the loss of her son. And they're all members of the church. She went to Freed-Hardeman back in the 50s. When we go through experiences like that, our faith feels unstable. We feel like we're at a point where if the wind blew hard enough, we would fall off the cliff. And what do we do when it seems like God is quiet? When it seems like God is distant? 1 Kings chapter 18 is the challenge that Elijah offered to the 400 prophets of Baal. And of course, Elijah won that challenge, and they wound up killing all of those 400 prophets. And there had been a drought. Elijah had prayed back in chapter 17 for there to be a drought, and God sent a drought in order to, of course, show Israel that Baal was not the god of the weather. Jehovah is the God of the weather. And then at the end of chapter 18, you might notice, beginning in verse 41, God sends rain. He has had his people kill the false prophets of Baal. Elijah has now proven to be the true prophet of the true God, and so the true God now sends rain to show that he is the one in charge of the weather. So Elijah has had a mountain peak experience, not unlike what you might experience on a Sunday. Especially if the song service is great and the sermon is great and you have fellowship with people, and that's great. Everything goes well. That was Elijah at the end of chapter 18. But then we see that circumstances can push us to despair. And I'm sure you would agree that we can have a mountain peak experience and then we can have a valley of despair, not just in the same week, but it can't happen in the same day. Begin reading with me in verse 1. King Ahab, told Queen Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and even more if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." So she's swearing an oath that she's going to kill Elijah. He was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, left his servant there, and he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers." He lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, "Arise and eat." He looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And so he ate and drank and lay down again. And then the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So Elijah has this victory, this great victory, but then that victory turns to fear, which turns to flight. Queen Jezebel Y'all know Queen Jezebel. She was one who thought it was a light thing to disobey God. She mocked obedience to God. And so now she puts a price on Elijah's head. And she and Ahab have already killed hundreds of prophets back in chapter 17, 18, early part of chapter 18. So she's already shown that she has no compunction against killing one of God's prophets. So Elijah knows that this threat is real. And so he runs, and then he runs some more, and then he runs some more. And he is worn out. So first of all, when you find yourself in the valley of despair, ask yourself, am I treating my body the way I need to treat it? Am I getting the rest I need? Am I getting the food I need? Elijah has to rest. God lets him rest. And then what else does God do? He feeds him. I know sometimes that you can get so stressed out that you just lose your appetite. But then that stress and loss of appetite is going to feed back into a weakened body, and the weakened body then feeds back into a depressed mindset. And we keep a negative cycle going. And so Elijah is at this point where, and Elijah is a faithful prophet of God, but now Elisha says, God, take my life. He is in such a valley of despair that he wants God to take his life. So even Christians, faithful Christians, can feel overwhelmed with things that are going on in life, so many things that you have to think about that are draining your energy, your mental energy, your spiritual energy, maybe even your physical energy. And all of that hardship distorts your perspective on life. They get overwhelmed. Elijah is overwhelmed. Elijah didn't think there was any more point in living. Elisha was in the mission field. The mission field was his own people. But Elisha was in the mission field, and he said, I'm going to wash my hands of it. I want to leave. I want to go home and be with God. I'm tired of it. Don't feel bad if you get tired of it. That's not a reflection necessarily on your faith if you just get tired of it. Elisha was tired. Now, we can wrongfully conclude that God has abandoned us, and Elijah, to a certain extent here, thinks that he's been abandoned. And so we feel this suffering. We experience this suffering. And we feel like God is not there. He's not answering prayers. He's just leaving us to struggle by ourselves. And we're just doing all we can to keep our head above water. And we feel like asking, where is God? Now, an interesting thing here is that Elijah is at Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. Scholars do not know exactly the relationship between Mount Hor and Mount Sinai. Apparently, Mount Sinai was a part of the mountain range that was known as Mount Horeb. So coming to Mount Horeb, essentially he's coming to the place where God did what for Israel? Gave them the law. He appeared to them at Mount Sinai in the earthquake and the smoke and the fire. And so God has brought Elijah to Mount Horeb to remind Elijah that God is faithful. God has made a covenant with his people. And God is faithful to that covenant. So let's read verses 9 through 13. He came there, that is to Mount Horeb, and he lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. That is an expression of power. The word of the Lord came. If you could remember like a cartoon where there's a fella sitting there and he's all sad and depressed, and then something like somebody off screen throws a brick and it hits him in the head to wake him up, to bring him out of his depression. That's kind of what this is. The word of the Lord comes to him and hits him upside the head, metaphorically speaking. So God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God knows. God knows what's in Elijah's heart, what's going on through his mind. He wants Elijah to think about it. Verse 10 rather. Elijah says, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, and they've torn down your altars, and they've killed your prophets with a sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And so God says, "Go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But Jehovah was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said the second time, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So I want us to pause here for just a moment and point out that God does not always work in spectacular ways. In fact, family, I would suggest to you, we tend to focus on the miracles that God performed because they're big deals. But I suggest to you that 9 times out of 10, God works in ways that are not visible. Even in the Bible. You know the story of Esther? God is not even mentioned in the book of Esther. And yet you can see his hand guiding things behind the scenes. In the story of Joseph going down into Egypt, I believe it's chapter 45 where God speaks to Jacob. And then in chapter 50, we've got references to a God. But in the in-between, chapter 46, 47, 48, 49, I might be exaggerating, but I don't think there's any references to God there. There's certainly not any reference to God doing something. God works in ways that are not visible, in ways that are not spectacular. In the rustling grass, I hear him pass. He speaks to me everywhere. God has worked in ways in the Bible times, in ways that are visible and powerful to let us know God can. God is in control of the world. He's in control of the weather. He's in control of diseases. He's in control of everything. But he doesn't have to do it miraculously. Sometimes God is just working quietly, softly behind the scenes. You and I have to trust that he's there. And not think that he has to be dramatic. Not think that he has to answer our prayers immediately in order for him to be working. I came across this style of art. I don't know how to pronounce the word. It's Japanese. Nihonga art. It requires the artist to do the work in layers. And if you looked at just the individual layers, it wouldn't look like much. But when you put all the layers together, you have a piece of artwork. Our lives are layers. And God is working in our lives in building these layers. Romans 8 I believe it's verse 29. This is part of the text that I'm doing at Ridge Road, May 2nd. That's the text where Paul says that God is working to conform us into the image of His Son, so that Jesus might be the firstborn among many brethren. God is working to conform us to be like His Son. We don't see the big picture. God does. We just perhaps see these individual layers, but we don't even see the layers above. All we can see is the layers in the past. So God is telling us to trust Him. He's working in our lives. Where is God's mighty works? Well, just because God is not working miraculously today does not mean that He's not working. His silence does not mean that He doesn't hear or He doesn't care. The still small voice. We also see in verses 13 through 18, the last part of this text that I want us to look at tonight, that we are not alone to face life together. Part of the reason why God designed His church is to be a social group. We are not just a social organization. We are far more important than just a social organization, but we are at least a social organization. Not to get through life by ourselves. Beginning in verse 13. Elijah heard this gentle blowing, verse 12. He wrapped his face in his mantle and he went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "Where are you? What are you doing, Elijah?" And Elijah says again, same words he used earlier, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." The Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael, king of Aram, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. It shall come about, the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. And yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." So you see, Elijah thought that he was the only one left. I don't know if you have heard this, but there's actually an expression, the Elijah complex, which refers to somebody who thinks they're the only ones that's doing right, the only ones who are trying to be faithful to God. But you've got to highlight verse 18 in your Bibles. God says, "I've reserved 7,000. I referred to this in my class this morning. I don't think that this is a literal number. 7, of course, is the biblical number for completion, so I think God is just telling Elijah, look, we've got a whole slew of people that's still faithful. 7,000. The problem, though, is the nation of Israel was maybe 3 million at this point. What's 7,000 among a nation of 3 million? You see how discouraging it could get? I don't know how many Christians there are in Romania today, and the high point when we were living there, it was estimated about 500 Christians. 500 Christians in an area the size of the state of Ohio is not a whole lot. It's probably half that today because so many Christians have immigrated out of the country. You got to go a long way to find somebody else who believes like you do. Which is the reason why I'm encouraging you to support Ridge Road first Saturday in May. Encourage them. I don't know about other speakers, but I've known about this lesson since February. If I'm doing this sermon, I had 6 days to get ready for this sermon. The sermon I'm doing at Ridge Road, I've got 4 months, 2 months, February to April, May, so 3 months. I could put a whole lot more thought and attention into a sermon if I got 3 months to prepare than if I've got 6 days to prepare. That's why sermons like that, like a gospel meeting, that's why those sermons are, those are like a 10 out of 10. Those are what I call Cadillac sermons. Because preacher's got all kind of time to prepare. It's going to be a good lesson, that's what I'm saying. But you don't go to hear me, you hear me all the rest of the year. Go to encourage your brethren. Go encourage your fellow Christians. They'll serve you lunch. You don't even have to be there to hear me if you don't want to. Just get there in the morning, stay till lunch if you just want to give up like half your day. God is telling Elijah, you're not alone. You're not alone. And he also tells Elijah, you know what we like to do when we get depressed? We want to wallow in our misery. We want to go home and be by ourselves. Don't call, don't visit. I'm happy being miserable. God says, Elijah, go to work. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. Get over your pity party and go to work. I want you to anoint Hazael as the king over Aram. Your translation might have Syria. Damascus was the capital. God says, I want you to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as the king over Israel. And Jehu is going to take care of King Ahab. Y'all remember that? He's going to take care of King Ahab. And then God says, Elijah, you need a helper. You need a buddy. You need an associate minister. Anoint Elisha. And Elisha came to be known as the one who poured water on the hands of Elijah. Most of the miracles that we have related to these prophets, Elisha is the one who did them. Elijah, I think, is more popular, but Elisha did more miracles. Several of Elisha's miracles are a framework for the miracles of Jesus. Elisha, for example, multiplied food like Jesus does bread. Elisha raised the dead. Elisha himself was contributed to somebody being raised from the dead through his bones in the grave. I spoke at a youth rally many years ago. Rachel and I were just newly married, and the elder in the church where I stayed, he and his wife built an extra room under their house for visiting preachers, and they called it the Elisha room. So God tells Elijah, you got to get to work. Anoint Elisha to be your helper. God provides people to help us. Now, the church could do more if we knew more of what the church could do. There's a lot of us that suffer and we just don't tell anybody. And when we don't tell anybody, nobody can help us. But if we tell people, if we share with people, then we can get the support we need. Because the church is supposed to be a support network. And when we isolate ourselves, that's when our perspective gets distorted. And we get a false view of our lives and false view perhaps of God. God has created us as human beings to need His presence and to need connections with other people, fellow Christians, encouragement from each other, because our loneliness just intensifies the suffering. God didn't accept that with Elijah. He said, you need a support network. And so Elijah helps us understand some things that we ought to do when we feel like our faith is being tested and God is not there to help us. He is there. He might be there in presence in our lives through fellow Christians, which is why we need to get together and have fellowship. The church retreat in October 16th through the 18th, the elders ideally would like to have, we had 198 people this morning. The elders would ideally like to have 198 people at a church retreat so that we can spend time together, have the men talk about doing things together next year, and the women talk about doing things together next year, and the parents talk about having activities for the youth next year, and have time together. Anna was a few years ago when she was in Nashville, Anna was struggling with connecting at the church where she was worshiping. For several months, from June till September, she just struggled with connecting with people. This is a 600-member congregation. Until the young women had a church retreat. A church retreat just has a different atmosphere. You let your hair down at a church retreat. I've been to a lot of church retreats. And it was then that she started forming relationships and started clicking with different people. And you know what she told Rachel and me one time? She said, it's starting to feel like Swartz Creek. That was her standard. We've got to have a support network. We need to remember God's faithfulness in our past, because faith can falter when it's put under pressure. God knows. Jesus knows. Jesus went through it. And so He's encouraging us to recognize that God's presence may come quietly. It may come in unusual ways. But we need to know that we're never alone. God is always there for us. And the clearest evidence of that, of course, is Jesus Christ. Jesus is our standard. God didn't abandon us. He sent Jesus. Jesus walks with us. As we study through the Bible on the subject of the Holy Spirit, we see the Holy Spirit is with us. Christ brings us hope, even when things are otherwise silent. Jesus lets us know that God is working for us, working all things together for our good. That's my topic for Ridge Road. God works all things together for our good. So look to Christ in your times of struggle. Trust God, even when you don't understand what the future holds. He's still walking with you. He's still leading the way. Rest in His grace. Find comfort in His faithfulness, because God really does want you in heaven. Does your church family need to pray for you? Does your church family need to encourage you tonight? If so, you've got to let us know. Otherwise, our prayers are just generic. God, please bless Nick. And Ed and Tammy. That's his mom and dad. But if you let us know, our prayers can be specific. So let us know if we need to, while we stand and sing.